So our second group of protozoans are characterized as those with flagella. Flagella are these whip-like structures that we mentioned before when we were talking about cell parts. And again, this is a eukaryotic cell. And so those whip-like structures, they don't really actually just whip, but they actually rotate around, and they allow an organism to be motile by the way that they run, tumble, and swarm. A lot of these live within animals, this group, and so usually when they live inside of an animal, we call that a symbiotic relationship. It doesn't always have to mean that it's a bad thing, and if it is bad, then we would say that it's pathogenic or that these organisms cause disease. And so the first example here, Trichonympha, they actually live, these are protozoans, and they live inside of a termite, and they actually help that termite by breaking down cellulose. And so what do they get from that? Well, cellulose is several glucose molecules put together, and so they actually get a food source. What do the termites get out of it? Those organisms have broken down the cellulose for them, which might be indigestible. And so others, like Trypanosoma, that's a common type, but these species, a lot of times, again, little protozoans, they are carried by a tsetse fly or some other type of bug, and they find themselves living in a human's or other organisms' bloodstream. And so this picture here kind of shows, well, this is actually showing toxoplasmosa, which we'll look at here in a little bit, but showing an organism living within the bloodstream. So these are blood cells here, and these are actually the organisms. Again, this is not quite with the right one, but we'll talk about them in a little bit here. All right, other examples that maybe you've heard of before, Giardia lamblia, and these little protozoans will be found in contaminated in water that's contaminated, and if a person swallows it or drinks it, swallows it while swimming or drinks it, they can then take residence up in that person and cause stomach cramps, diarrhea, and terrible smelling gas. Another example is Trichomonas vaginalis, and this is an organism that can be transmitted sexually, can actually survive on things like towels and toilet seats too as well, and then kind of wait to find its host. Can't survive forever, but for a decent amount of time. And so this can cause itching and burning pain in the genital regions as well. Another example, Leishmania. This is actually transmitted by a sand fly, and a lot of times in the military, people come across this when they're in the desert with the troops. And so this example is a cutaneous infection here of someone who's infected with Leishmania. But all of these organisms are carried in a host, and again, this hosts are sometimes, a lot of times they can be insects. Another example here is Euglena, and so Euglena is a mixotroph, which means that it can use photosynthesize, but it also can feed on organic matter as well. And these are pretty common to find. If you were ever to look at a sample of pond water, you probably would see these quite easily as well. But again, they do have flagella, and that's why they find themselves in this classification group. So the next group are those with cilia. Cilia is also extensions of the cell membrane, but these are tiny little kind of hair-like extensions rather than a longer flagella. And so protozoans in this group are pretty diverse. There's a lot of different examples. Some can actually be pretty large, but all of them would have this cilia as well. Some of them even have a little bit of a nerve network, and so a nerve network, like we have a brain and spinal cord with nerves coming off. Primitive means it's pretty simple, but it's still considered to be a nervous system. And so this allows them to actually change their movement, maybe to move towards food or to get away from predators. And so a lot of times they actually will be enclosed by a pellicle, and then these things called trichocysts can be expelled out of the pellicle to actually catch prey as they kind of dart by, and so then they can take it back into the cell. Some of them also contain a contractile vacuole, and that can kind of fill up with fluid, and then they can expel the fluid, and that sometimes allows things to actually move around as well. A lot of these organisms contain a macronucleus and a micronucleus, and this is just a different arrangement of the chromosomes inside a cell. And so because of this, they are able to either use sexual reproduction by conjugation. Conjugation means that two cells would come together and exchange information, or asexual reproduction, meaning that the DNA would just be copied, be a similar copy. All the sets of chromosomes would be there, and they can pass that information on as well. And so examples in this group, you can see there's cilia here, paramecium, that's probably the most common example that maybe you've heard of before. And so the cilia are just on the edges here. You can just barely kind of see, and it just kind of looks like it's a little fuzzy on here, but a lot of cilia in this case. Vorticella as an example here. Those are kind of interesting looking. And then another, about the only pathogenic one would really be, or one of the pathogenic ones would be Balantidium coli. And so a lot of times it's not the actual trophozoite that's swallowed, but the cysts when they go into those kind of desiccant conditions or when nutrients are harsh. And then once somebody swallows the cyst, then the cell can go back to its trophozoite stage and maybe cause some damage. Another group here, and there's quite a few in here, are the apicomplexans mostly, and these are considered to be non-motile, meaning they don't have flagella or cilia or pseudopods in a way to kind of get around on their own. But like I said before, they really do get around pretty easily. And so all of these would be considered to be parasites, meaning they're going to live within a host and cause disease. And so because they're non-motile, their life cycle usually involves more than one host. So some examples here, and we'll be studying this further within our module assignments, but the Plasmodium species, Plasmodium genus, there's several different types of species. It causes malaria. Malaria is a disease of the blood, and it can be pretty deadly and cause some pretty terrible symptoms. It's not super common in the United States. It is around, but in Africa it's really very common. And its life cycle involves the mosquito and the human. And so when we look at a lot of these life cycles, we'll kind of look at the definitive host versus the intermediate host. And so a definitive host is basically defined because sexual reproduction takes place in this host. So in the mosquito, we're actually combining gametes in order to form the organism here as well. And so this happens in the mosquito. The mosquito then bites the human, and the parasite enters the bloodstream. It actually travels in the blood to the liver. It goes into the red blood cells, and it completes its asexual reproduction here as well. And so then sex cells are formed in order to go and to combine together for sexual reproduction. So, and you can kind of think of, you have a mosquito that has this, it passes it on to a human, a mosquito bites another human, picks it up, passes it on to another mosquito. And if you think about mosquitoes and how easy it is to get bit by them, imagine if you're living in a country where you don't have shelter and you don't have a place to go to get away from mosquitoes very easily. Another one that maybe you've heard of before is Toxoplasma gondii, and a lot of people may get infected with this, but really where it's a problem is if a woman is pregnant, because it can cause death to a fetus. And so this is very commonly picked up through litter boxes, cats' litter boxes, if they have their litter boxes, inside as pets. And so this organism then gets passed on from a cat to possibly a human, and then who passes it on in the first place? Maybe the mice. And so the protozoan is living in these three different hosts with different cycles from time to time and getting passed on that way. This is why pregnant women should not clean the cat box, or at least have their cats tested for this to make sure that they do not have this. But it's pretty common for them to have. And so this just also kind of shows your life cycle here a little bit. If the organism is in the mouse and then the cat eats the mouse, well, then the organism gets passed on to the cat. The cat passes it on through the feces, and then something picks up it through the feces as well. So maybe the mouse picks it up again, maybe a human picks it up again. Studies have also been done that mice that are infected with this organism tend to lose their fear of cats. And so this is an example of how the organism can really kind of program this mouse. And the organism's goal is to continue its life cycle. So if this mouse is less afraid of cats, that's more likely that that mouse will be eaten by the cat. So it's pretty interesting to see how some of these life cycles take over. Other protists, so besides kind of the animal-like protozoans, kind of classify these as unicellular autotrophs. So single cells, and autotrophs meaning they can make their own food. A lot of times if we call them a photoautotroph, we're talking about using photosynthesis in order to produce their own food. So in the case of photosynthesis, organisms can use carbon dioxide, which to us is a waste product. When it combines with water and using light energy from the sun, the organism can produce glucose, which would be its food source, and then give off oxygen gas. So this is what plants do, but we can also look at this when we look at algae and things like that. And so basically phytoplankton talks about those organisms that do use sunlight in order to make their own food. And so any sort of plankton that we look at are organisms that live near the ocean's surface. And we don't see them very easily, but there are actually so many that it's a big part of the aquatic food chain. And these organisms produce most of the Earth's oxygen compared to plants. So as far as photosynthesis goes, these little guys that are kind of on a layer of all the Earth's bodies of water, do all of that production for us, which is nice. Other unicellular autotrophs, there's a group called the dinoflagellates, and these are kind of an odd group as well. So we see they are in our mixed bag. Their cell walls are pretty rigid. They contain cellulose and silicon. Silicon makes them pretty strong. Some of them are bioluminescent, meaning that if they were in the ocean in the dark, you would actually see them glow. So they would glow in the dark. And this gives light sometimes in the ocean sources as well. It's pretty cool to see. If you can see the waves crashing at night, sometimes you can see a glow in there as well. A lot of times these organisms may grow too well, and when that happens, this is called an algal bloom. So for them, conditions are right, and there's really an overgrowth. If we have an overgrowth of anything, sometimes that usually causes a problem. It upsets the balance of nature. And so a lot of times these will be called red tides because they actually will be seen like this picture here, where you can see all of these organisms. And a lot of times they also will use too much of the oxygen in the water, so they upset the oxygen balance. And then a lot of times these produce toxins. And so a few toxins are okay, but when they're in such great amounts, they can actually kill the aquatic life, the fish and the shellfish and things like that. The other problem is that if we then eat these things that come from here and they are infected with these toxins, maybe it didn't kill them, but they're built up in there, and then toxins can get transferred to humans as well. Another group are the diatoms. The diatoms are pretty cool. They have this stark-looking structure too because their shells are made up of silicon dioxide. And so you may have heard before the term diatomaceous earth. I think I have a typo there. Should have two A's there, diata. But a lot of times they're used in products, and so they kind of help with these polishing, filtering, insulation, and then you can harvest petroleum from them as well. These guys have really accumulated in the oceans over millions of years as well. Green algae. Green algae have a lot in common to plants. Some green algae can be multicellular. We're kind of focusing now on those that are unicellular and part of that phytoplankton. But they actually have photosynthetic pigments just kind of like plants do. So they're definitely related. Algae are not plants because they can't really live without a water source. They don't have roots and things like that. A lot of times we also see this alteration of generations, or alteration, not alternation, another typo there, sorry, where sometimes they perform asexual reproduction and sometimes they perform sexual and kind of on a rotational basis, and this allows them to be more successful. A couple examples here, Chlamydomonas that's shown here. This kind of occurs as a single cell. And then Volvox is really cool. There's a single Volvox here. They live in a colony, and so they kind of travel together, and they look really neat to see. If you look at them live under a microscope, you can see them rolling and twisting and turning, and it's pretty cool. This just kind of shows a little bit like the life cycle. We look at asexual reproduction, and you can have sexual reproduction. That's that alternation of generations. When they can do both, they can mix up the DNA. If we have sexual reproduction, then the DNA is getting more diverse. If we have asexual, it's staying the same, but that might be a real easy way to get new products of those cells. So the alternation of generations is shown here as well on the right. So looking at kind of going between mitosis and meiosis as far as how they are forming certain things here as well. We'll look at this more when we look at fungi. Some others that fall into kind of these odd categories, slime molds. These kind of have a lot of different characteristics. As of now, they're put in the Protist kingdom, but that may change. Slime molds can be acellular or cellular. These shown here are cellular. They kind of look like a single cell, but then they kind of aggregate together and actually form a cool structure called a fruiting body. The acellular slime molds are shown here. On the left, they're in the feeding stage and they kind of grow and branch out. And then on the right, they're actually forming spores and forming stalks because they're not doing as well. Nutrients are a little more scarce. And sometimes you can actually see these grow over time as well. Another group here, the water molds. These are little protists living in the water. They kind of resemble fungi, which is another kingdom, but they actually have cellulose in their cell walls, and so that's what puts them into the protist kingdom here as well. They can be pathogenic to plants a lot of times in the water.